Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. This is now part 7 of our series on the whole Bible. Today we are on the books of the Old Testament history. These are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now, by my calculations, factoring in the time spent on an intro and outro, that gives us a hair over 2 minutes for each book, so don't expect this to answer every question and make you an expert. There's absolutely no substitute for sitting down and reading these books yourself. And while all of them are mercifully shorter than the likes of Genesis and Exodus, they're mostly a lot longer than the likes of 3 John or Obadiah. There's no getting around that there are chunks of most of these books that are a bit of a chore to get through, especially when they don't offer much in the way of application to our daily struggles. For example, let's turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 24 and read verses 7 through 17. The first lot fell to Jehoiarib, the second to Jediah, the third to Harim, the fourth to Seorim, the fifth to Malchijah, the sixth to Mijamin, the seventh to Hakkoz, the eighth to Abijah, the ninth to Jeshua, the 10th to Shechaniah, the 11th to Eliashib, the 12th to Jakim, the 13th to Huppah, the 14th to Jeshebeab, the 15th to Bilgah, the 16th to Immer, the 17th to Hezir, the 18th to Hapizez, the 19th to Pethahiah, the 20th to Jehezkel, the 21st to Jakin, the 22nd to Gamul. Please make it stop. While I'd like to say that I pored over these books for a couple hours to find the best passage to make that point and settled on this one as utterly devoid of substantive value, I flipped to it randomly. Okay, in all fairness, even that passage has value and can teach us something if we're willing to consider its context and put in the time and effort to learn from it. In this case, we're seeing the level of attention to detail David is imparting on the organization of the priesthood and their worship at the proto-temple/improved tabernacle, and more importantly, looking forward to the real temple he'd commissioned his son and heir Solomon to build. At the same time, there's an implicit acknowledgement that not everything can be apportioned exactly according to merit or ability, that the luck of the draw is a factor even in something as important as the worship of God. It's a minor point, but there is a point. Most of the history books aren't as dry as that. They actually include some of the most rip-roaring stories in the whole Bible, and although I have to fudge a couple of definitions in order to say this, I can make a pretty strong case that there's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll in these books. It's always viewed through the lens of God's law and his covenant with Israel, and we see repeatedly that his people fail to hold up their end of the bargain. But God is always faithful, including promises to pass judgment for the people's sin. So let's start with Joshua. This book picks up right where Deuteronomy left off, literally beginning after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, "Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel." There's a lot more to this talk between God and Joshua, but by and large, the story of the book concerns fulfilling those exact predictions. The people prepare to cross the Jordan in various ways for the first couple chapters, and in chapters 3 and 4 they actually do it, setting up a memorial of 12 big rocks to commemorate that God stopped the flow of the river and let them cross on dry ground. Shortly thereafter they begin to conquer the homeland that is theirs by birthright, beginning with the city of Jericho. As the toughest nut to crack around there and the first step in conquest, Jericho gets a lot of attention, spanning chapters 2 and 6 and spilling over into the next phase, a small city called Ai, which proves to be a problem because one Israelite didn't take God's instructions with respect to Jericho very seriously. That wraps up in chapter 8, and by chapter 9, one nation, the Gibeonites, are so scared of Israel that they decide to fool the invaders into making a bad peace deal before they get Jericho'd. Continuing on from there, Israel fights against pretty much everyone, and God gives them the land in stages over a period of some years. We don't know exactly how long all of this took. By chapter 15, they're ready to start parceling out the land by tribe, and although there are still numerous pockets of various Canaanites and other ethnic groups throughout the whole region, by and large the Israelites become the dominant force. Finally, in chapter 24, Joshua delivers a farewell address, and it includes one of the most quoted verses in the Bible. Let's read some of the speech. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The end of chapter 24 records Joshua's death and the reinterment of Joseph's bones in the land Joseph owned before going down to Egypt. All is right with the world. God's promises are fulfilled, and the Israelites have just reaffirmed their commitment to God. And then, Judges is not so pleasant. The Israelites forget God and allow the remaining Gentiles in their land to exert influence on them in a variety of ways, most importantly in the religious department. God's not happy and stops protecting them, and then these other nations start to succeed in oppressing the Israelites. Let's read verses 18 and 19 of Judges chapter 2. "Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways." And so the cycle continues, with a judge rescuing them and a period of relative calm and amity between Israel and God, and then they turn away and they get into idolatry, and then God forsakes them, and then they end up oppressed by the surrounding nations again, and then they cry out to God, and then God sends them a judge, and here we are again. The conflict is usually regional, and so are the leaders that God raises up to deal with the various problems when the people eventually repent and turn back to Him. In the book called Judges, there are 12 canonical judges, and the pattern repeats itself every time, although in a few cases we're left to assume practically all of the details. Israel gets its first taste of monarchy through a usurper named Abimelech, whose story is found in chapter 9. Suffice to say, it ain't pretty. Eventually, this cycle culminates with the story of Samson, who is easily the most interesting of the judges and whose faults and triumphs are pretty relatable, although we generally experience them on a much smaller scale. He represents extremes in zeal and in slavery to passions and vices, and is a supremely tragic figure. Finally, chapters 17 through 21 are some of the roughest chapters in the Bible to get through. Let's just say, if these chapters were a movie, it would be difficult to get anything lower than the NC-17 rating placed on it without removing significant chunks. The point all of this brutality and evil is trying to make is repeated several times within those last few chapters, including the very last verse of the book, which is definitely a well thought out conclusion. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Humans are terrible at choosing good over evil. Israel failed. Ruth is a much more pleasant story that takes place in the same time period as the Judges, but toward the end of it. It describes a handful of righteous individuals who actually follow God's laws and thereby make an ever crummier situation blossom into a beautiful, new, happy family, blessed by God and preparing to bless the nation of Israel. Ruth, the more or less main character, goes from being an outsider in every way — she's a Gentile, she's poor, she's without a family, she's a sojourner, she's a widow — to being accepted into a good and well-to-do family in the tribe of Judah, married to a good man and giving birth to a son. Eventually, her great-grandson will be named David. Yep, that David. The point of the story is that even the great King David had incredibly low origins. But God's love, expressed through the keeping of God's law, led to great blessings for David, and his reign over Israel would be a great blessing for the whole nation. Now we come to 1st and 2nd Samuel. These books are slightly confusing from our perspective because there's not an obvious rhyme or reason for the separation of 1st and 2nd. It's not like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, two distinct letters to the same audience, nor is it Samuel and then Samuel 2, the sequel. It's especially confusing in that 2 Samuel contains not even a single appearance by its title character. He's not even mentioned in all of 2 Samuel. This came about because the books were originally one, but were too long to reasonably fit in one scroll, and so they were separated. Samuel is the main character for quite a good portion of the first half, and the first couple of chapters are almost entirely devoted to explaining where this guy came from and how he ended up as the best judge the nation of Israel ever had. Then, as he gets too old, it all starts to fall apart. It descends into monarchy. Let's read the first 9 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 8. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. Well, Samuel relays this to the people and tells them all of the horrible things the king will do. Basically, they're giving away an enormous portion of their God-given freedom and signing up for ever-increasing taxes and military conscription and the loss of their relative autonomy. What's their response? Verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey their voice and make them a king. This is a lesson everyone everywhere should learn, but unfortunately most people don't. And power tends to leave the hands of the populace and become consolidated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, who are less and less accountable, and who eventually, without exception, abuse that power at the expense of their subjects. Anyway, the man chosen to be the first king of Israel is named Saul, and he's not too bad at first, but he rebels against God and continually displays a high level of insecurity and impulse, neither of which serves him well. As a result, in 1 Samuel 15, verse 28, And Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. The better man is, of course, David, and the rest of 1 Samuel involves David's profile rising and Saul trying to undermine him, or kill him, depending on the day. All right, mostly he's trying to kill him. Eventually, Saul dies in battle with the Philistines, and David is proclaimed king. Up to now, we've only seen David in a positive life. He's just great. And then, having reached the pinnacle, a benevolent monarch who serves God and his nation selflessly, he slacks off and starts a downhill spiral. 2 Samuel 11 and following covers David's affair with the wife of one of his generals. The lady is named Bathsheba. And that leads to an attempted cover-up and eventually the murder of the general in question. Things get worse from there. David's own household starts to crumble and turn against him, aided by his indecisive parenting and disregard for national security where his kids are concerned. One son, Absalom, leads a rebellion against him, which eventually is put down. Things are more or less stable by the end of the book, but it's still easy to see how far David has fallen in his later years. Then we come to 1 Kings. At this point, David is so old as to be basically useless in his role as king, and another son, Adonijah, thinks the time is right to assert himself, even though David had promised the throne to Solomon. It's a nail-biting situation, but Solomon has enough support, just barely, to correct this wrong, and he reigns for a time even before David dies, the first of many co-regencies that occur throughout Israel's history, although many of them aren't immediately apparent in the records. Solomon consolidates his power and then begins a new mini-golden age, blessed and enabled by God. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before, and none like you shall arise after you. It sounds great, and there's a lot to back this up. Solomon is wise and powerful, and he's also a peaceful ruler. He builds an incredible structure at unfathomable expense to house the Ark of the Covenant and serve as God's figurative throne on earth. All appears to be well unless you look closely. It spills out into the open in chapter 11. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. Child sacrifice. That's how Molech was worshipped. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. This happens under his son's reign. The kingdom splits into two. The southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin under Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and the northern tribes, all the rest, under Jeroboam, an official in Solomon's administration. The rest of 1st and 2nd Kings follow these two kingdoms, sometimes allied, mostly fighting, and their various struggles, failures, and triumphs. Most of the kings are unequivocally bad, and I'd hate to live under the vast majority of them. Judah has a few gems in there, but you have to get past a lot of garbage to find them. And Israel, the northern kingdom, has one half gem, Jehu, who listened to God's prophets and had a great chance to set things right, but caved in at the opportune moment and became just another sellout. It's sad, tragic, really, because both kingdoms bring about their own downfall through disregarding God's instructions. Israel is conquered by Assyria in the 720s BC, and Judah is conquered by Babylon in the 590s BC. And that's it for 1st and 2nd Kings. Chronicles, same deal, 1st and 2nd, covers mostly the same ground, but it puts a lot of focus on genealogies and catalogs of names. You're in chapter 10 before there's any real narrative, and that's parallel to the end of 1 Samuel, going over Saul's death in battle. The rest of 1 Chronicles covers David's reign, mostly in the same terms as what we saw back in 2 Samuel. 2 Chronicles begins, Solomon the son of David established himself in his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him, and made him exceedingly great. From there, it covers Solomon's reign in 9 chapters, and then follows the kings of Judah from Rehoboam down to the destruction of Jerusalem. Mostly here we're reading about people we already knew from 1st and 2nd Kings, but occasionally there are additional details we didn't already know. And while Kings focused its attention more on the northern kingdom after the split, Chronicles is almost exclusively about the south. Its ending isn't as tragic as the ending of 2 Kings, though. Instead of leaving off with captivity, it jumps forward several decades to briefly preview what comes next. Now in the 1st year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus king of Persia, The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. That return back home is the topic of the next 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is basically about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, along with the attending city, but the temple is certainly Ezra's focus. It covers the many struggles of the returned exiles to get their work done in the face of opposition from the newly settled Gentile groups in the region, who see the Jews as a threat to them and who tattle incessantly to the Persian emperor. Ezra is sent back to Judea specifically to teach the people the law and oversee the justice system. He finds the problem worse than he had expected, but puts his nose to the grindstone and does the hard work of teaching the populace of this newly reformed nation how to live godly lives in keeping with God's laws and thus please him and secure his favor. Nehemiah is more on the same topic, but with a new guy as the main character, and the focus is on building the walls, not the temple itself. Now they have a temple and a sizable population, and that's nice, but they're not very well protected, and there are nefarious types around who would love to see them fall. Nehemiah is the cupbearer of the Persian king Artaxerxes, and he requests leave to go back to Jerusalem and help get the wall built. And at the end of verse 8 of chapter 2, it says, "The king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me." Nehemiah goes back and finds the whole system in disarray, and he whips the people into shape. The best-known passage in this book comes in chapter 4, when he's having some success, and just like back in Ezra, the Gentiles of the surrounding area decide to put a stop to this building. Chapter 4, verse 16. "From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out." Well, Nehemiah doesn't fool around. At this rate, they quickly complete their work, and Nehemiah, just like Ezra, ends up dealing with moral issues among the Jews. The rich are oppressing the poor. Big surprise. Nehemiah makes them stop. He found the government wasteful and extravagant. Big surprise. He stripped it down and put a stop to the profiteering. He finds that the Feast of Booths hasn't been celebrated properly in ages, and he corrects the problem. He finds that the priests were being shorted their fair share of the offerings and sees that the law is followed and that they are properly supplied. He finds that the people aren't keeping the Sabbath. He uses every lever of power available to him to fix this problem too. Finally, he finds more of the intermarriage with Gentiles that Ezra addressed a while ago, and I have to read this one because it's hilarious. Nehemiah 13:25, "And I confronted them, and cursed them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath on the name of God, saying, You shall not take your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves." Again, it's a different set of standards between then and now, and this is not the way to enforce God's rules today. But let me point out that this guy was on speaking terms with the most powerful man in the world. And here he is, beating the snot out of people who transgressed the law of Moses and getting them to change their ways and rededicate themselves to the service of the Lord. It's comical, to say the least. That's Nehemiah's legacy and the end of his book. And from there we shift the setting to the royal city of Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, to meet Esther. Esther is the final book of history in the Old Testament. There are basically 3 interconnected separate plots going simultaneously, and they all converge to show God's providence in rescuing the Jewish nation throughout the empire from the murderous predations of an unpleasant man named Haman. First, the queen rejects the king's call to present herself and is therefore demoted from being queen, and a process is established for choosing a new favorite wife for the king. Esther ends up being entered into the contest, and she ends up winning it. It is not widely known that she is a Jew, because anti-Semitism is a very old bigotry. Plot number 2. Esther's cousin and father figure, Mordecai, is apparently employed as a worker in the king's palace, and he overhears a conspiracy to assassinate the king. And he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. Sometime later, the king thinks, I really should do something for that guy, and so he asks one of his advisors in veiled terms what sort of honors should be given to the best of all possible subjects. The advisor, Haman, who, as it happens, really hates Mordecai, has no clue Mordecai is the guy the king means. In fact, he's such a narcissist that he assumes it's Haman himself who stands to gain all these honors. When the king makes him lift up Mordecai, his desire to kill Mordecai and his entire ethnic group only intensifies, of course. Plot number 3. Most of Haman's plan was already in place. and it involved calling open season on Jews throughout the empire. He convinced the not-too-bright king to make a decree that stated on a certain date it would become legally permissible for anyone to rob and kill their Jewish neighbors. When Mordecai and Esther hear of this, of course, they are somewhat alarmed and spring into action. Esther enters the king's presence uninvited, an inversion, by the way, of the offense that got her predecessor canned, and because the king favors her, he allows her in, and she arranges a dinner, at which she arranges a second dinner, at which she reveals that the king's most trusted advisor, Haman, effectively wants to murder her, the king's favorite wife and queen, because, turns out, she's Jewish. The king is not pleased, and swiftly does away with Haman using the very same implement Haman had intended to use to execute Mordecai. Then the king makes another decree declaring that now the Jews are free to defend themselves by any means necessary and turn the tables to plunder anyone who attacks them. It all works out in the end, and this whole incident is commemorated every year in the Jewish feast of Purim. And that's it for the histories. Throughout all of them, there is a consistent message. God has rules and expectations and passes judgment on those who reject him and rebel against him. However, those who love and serve him, he blesses. Even in these books, it's not always a pretty picture, even for the righteous. Evil people cause untold harm and misery, and frequently the righteous are left holding the bag. But in the long term, and on the grand scale, God is directing the course of events as he wishes to uphold justice and mercy. For us, it's not as simple as this, because we know a lot more about God's promises for once this life is over. But the same basic pattern holds. He wants to provide a beautiful, peaceful, restful home for those who love him. Those who reject him, he casts out of his presence and out of his blessings. Would you prefer to be one of those grafted into his holy nation like Ruth, given a home in a land flowing with milk and honey like Joshua, blessed with his love and protection like David, or to be thrown out and oppressed and deprived of all joy because you had your chance and you knew the rules and you didn't take God seriously? The choice is yours, as it has been for every individual we've discussed today and every individual who's ever lived. I encourage you, even if you've rejected God before, even if you're mired in sin and the consequences from it, to turn to God and appeal to him for help. One of the ways he helps is by sending his followers to provide instruction, encouragement, and assistance. We saw that, especially with Ezra and Nehemiah today. That's what we at River Ridge would like to do for you. Feel free to get in touch with us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org, and we would love to help you with your spiritual struggles, teach you more about God and his Word, and his expectations of you and me. You can also drop by and visit us in person at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, Indiana, for our 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Sunday worship and our 7 p.m. Wednesday Bible study. We'd love to meet you, we'd love to worship with you, we'd love to study with you, and we'd love to work side by side with you to accomplish God's work in this world. I hope to see you there, but until then, thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.